my father died for his faith. He died solely because he was a Catholic and just because of the hatred that exists in this country.
The perfect opportunity for the Army's new agent was not to catch the murder gang who killed Michael Parr. It was, according to the secret Army records, an opportunity for their agent to join the gang, to help make their targeting more professional. Brian Nelson was to ensure the proper targeting of provisional IRA members prior to any shooting. Every week, Nelson would secretly meet soldiers from the Force Research Unit who, in the jargon of the spy world, were his handlers. They told Agent 6137 they wanted him to take control of the Loyalist murder gang's targeting. According to the Army records, Nelson was to get these gangs to concentrate on specific targeting of legitimate Republican terrorist targets. To help Nelson identify these targets, his handlers set him up as a minicab driver. This gave him cover to enter hardline Republican areas where most of the targets lived. Nelson relished this cloak and dagger world, as he wrote in a private journal.
I was bitten by a bug. Hooked is probably a more appropriate word. One becomes enmeshed in a web of intrigue, conspiracies, confidences, dangers, and the power of being aware of things that others around you aren't. The power of this phenomenon acts like a drug.
Nelson recorded the addresses, the cars and movements of those to be shot by Loyalist murder gangs of the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA.
He would only work on supposedly legitimate IRA targets.
What is a legitimate IRA target?
Well, one that the UDA will have proof has been involved in attacks, in bombings, in murders.
The Army wanted Nelson to work hand in glove with killers like this man, Ken Barrett. We made contact with Barrett a year ago, and to our surprise, he eventually agreed to meet us. We've had 12 meetings with him, which we've recorded secretly. Like Nelson, Barrett wanted to hit only Republican targets, which is why Nelson passed their details to him.
Now, if you were operating with us, and you knew the score then, that when we asked you for something, you knew what was coming next. You're not fucking stupid. Brian had been involved in a brave whale himself. He knew what the score was. I mean, if we asked him details in the Republican, he knew it wasn't to send them fucking postcards. Like, I mean, they're not passing us documentation to sit in the house and read it. They're passing us documentation because they know what's going to result afterwards. You know what I mean?
I certainly got to know what Barrett meant. Later, I asked him how many men he'd killed. He held up both hands, showing 10 fingers.
Ken Barrett was known to be a well-placed, high-ranking member of the UDA in North Belfast. A dangerous, dangerous individual. Certainly the most frightening individual that ever I had to meet as a detective officer. We suspected he was a killer. And there is a common denominator. You look into these men's eyes. Certainly as an interviewer for 30 years, talking to them across a table, there is a peculiarity, like a common denominator. And yes, I had no doubt he was a killer.
So murky was this relationship between murder gangs and the Army. It's been the subject of 3 police investigations over 13 years, all headed by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir John Stevens. Often the undercover war in Ireland had to get dirty. But never this dirty, his final report will say. Was what was done in the name of the state defensible?
I think if you look at the work that we did, and this has been the most extensive criminal inquiry in history, the work we did in discovering what the activities of the double agent, so-called double agent Nelson, was involved in, of course that was inexcusable.
Tonight, for the first time, some of the detectives who've worked under Sir John Stevens speak publicly about the most sensitive police investigation in modern times.
Let me have a clear answer on this. Did the Stevens inquiry come to the conclusion that military intelligence was colluding with their agent to ensure that the Loyalists shot the right people?
Yes. That was the conclusion that we came to. There was certainly an agreement between his handlers and Nelson that the targeting should concentrate on what they described as the right people.
The introduction of internment in 1971, which began a new phase of the struggle in Ireland.
One of the right people was Alex Maskey. He's a member of Sinn Féin, political wing of the Provisional IRA. 14 years ago, Maskey was their leader on Belfast City Council. On the afternoon of the 17th of July 1988, Nelson spotted Maskey's car outside a Belfast restaurant. Maskey had gone there to have Sunday lunch.
Nelson went around North Belfast trying to recruit an assassination team. And when one unit were unable to assist, he moved on until he found another one.
Was that role as an agent provocateur?
Absolutely.
Do you think that Brian Nelson wanted Alex Maskey murdered on that day?
Yes.
The first assassination team Nelson approached couldn't get to their weapons in time. So he raised a second team, one of whom was the gunman Ken Barrett. Barrett went into the restaurant, but he was too late. Maskey had just left.
I mean, I actually went into that place and stood and had a glass of beer, like. He wasn't there. And he wasn't there. And yet withal, after I had left it, a couple of hours later, I'm standing on Highfield Rangers having a drink. Brian comes in and says, "He's seen him, man."
The secret military intelligence records show that at 7:55 that evening, Nelson telephoned his handler, Sergeant Margaret Walshaw. This is the transcript of their conversation, in which Nelson refers to a Mr. Heckler, by which he means the gun that had been brought to kill Maskey.
He just missed death by about 20 seconds. I was involved up to my neck with a Mr. Heckler. I'm not. I only missed him by 20 seconds. It's because it took so long to set it up.
Sergeant Walshaw then asked Nelson what was going to happen next.
If he's there next Sunday, he's going down.
The secret army unit for whom Nelson worked existed, supposedly, to save lives. They were under orders to pass the police life-saving intelligence as soon as possible. But no warning about the planned assassination of Maskey the following Sunday was passed to the police.
Why do you think it is that the army didn't warn the police?
The conclusion must be that they didn't want the police to be at the scene.
Do you think the army were prepared, therefore, to allow events to take their course?
In the absence of any other explanation coming from the army, that is the view that I would take, yes.
Because Maskey didn't return to the restaurant the following Sunday, he survived. Today, he's just been elected Sinn Féin's first Lord Mayor of Belfast. Those who colluded in the attempt to kill him did, however, have one complaint about their agent, his cowboy attitude to targeting. Their concern, however, was less about Nelson having set up the assassination than about him getting caught. 6137 has been warned we cannot help him if he's caught by the RUC. The army had always intended their agent to take more of a back seat. They wanted him to stick to supplying just the names and addresses of the targets, but there was a problem. When Nelson joined the Loyalist murder gangs, their intelligence came from files, many of which were out of date.
They used to bring fucking that, you know, hit the button up, just crack. There you are, Ken, you know.
They used to be fucking, they were throwing them down, and we went through our ones, people were dead on them. Now, I don't mean dead through terrorist activity, I mean fucking dead through natural causes.
Nelson's problem was that he didn't know which files were accurate and which were out of date. His army handlers came up with a solution. In October 1987, Nelson gathered up all the old targeting files he'd inherited from the Loyalists when he joined. Many had been leaked down the years from sympathizers in the security forces. The files included police and army intelligence on IRA suspects, photographs and maps. There were so many files, well over 1,000, that they filled a bin liner and a cardboard box. One night, Nelson drove these files to a pre-arranged meeting point. There, he met his British Army handlers. They loaded the entire Loyalist targeting system into the boot of their car and drove it to their army depot. Back at base, all the up-to-date files were selected and reorganized. The out-of-date stuff was destroyed. Everything was copied, which meant crucially the army now had a record of who might be shot. A few days later, Nelson's handlers returned only the files of IRA terrorists who were still active. From these up-to-date files, Nelson wrote down each target's name, address, and any other personal details on blue index cards. Attached to each card was a photograph, one card for each target.
You knew there were intelligence matters of some description. They contained personal details about supposed IRA suspects.
Did Brown seem concerned that you had seen these cards?
Yes, he was. I had seen them, I think, because he wasn't really thinking. And he had let me see them, and then he very quickly realised that I shouldn't be seeing these, and it was bad for his business that I, see these things. So they were put away very, very quickly. And the matter glossed over, as it were.
The secret army records show that once the targeting information had been gathered and checked by 6137, it would be passed on for action. The main emphasis of targeting would now be on accuracy. Within a year, military intelligence were reporting that thanks to their agent, the targeting by Loyalist murder gangs was more professional. This was only just beginning to happen with 6137 in his current position. Nothing could have been further from the truth.
I got the children ready for bed and put them into their bunk beds. I said a quick prayer with them and told them to hurry up and go to sleep because it's school in the morning.
The army agent Brian Nelson had found the Loyalist murder gangs a new IRA target, or so he thought.
Mummy said goodnight, give us a kiss and hug, and she left the room and went back downstairs.
We just sat down to watch news at 10.
A Soviet spy satellite, probably nuclear-powered, is falling to Earth. 11 soccer fans cleared the police fabric.
And just as I sat down, there was a loud, horrendous thundering noise. As soon as I came into the room, they started shooting. They just started shooting, and you just feel you're in the middle of a nightmare, that you're going to wake up any second. This just cannot be happening. I lifted the vacuum cleaner and caught one of them on his arm. And he brought the gun up and put it to my head, just more or less between my eyes. Terry screamed to me. He just screamed. It was just pain. I thought I shot him twice in the chest. Terry slumped to the ground and the two gunmen ran out the door.
Terry McDade, aged 29, and a father of 2 young girls, had been mortally wounded.
I got up out of the bed and went down the stairs, and I turned to the living room, but I seen my daddy lying on the floor. His eyes were closed and there was lots of people in the room, but I couldn't really see the people in the room. I was just looking at my daddy.
At home that night, Brian Nelson tuned into the police frequency on his scanner. What he heard sent him into a panic.
I think basically he panicked because he phoned his handlers on a number of occasions that night.
But what was his concern?
I think his concern was that they shot the wrong man.
As a result of his targeting?
Yes.
Nelson had sent the gunman to the wrong address. Once again, his army handler that night was Sergeant Walshaw. Normally, Nelson's calls were automatically taped and transcribed. This was a basic rule of agent handling. Nelson made 4 calls that night. But when the Stevens inquiry came to investigate, there were no transcripts of any of the conversations.
Why do you think they were missing?
I can't speculate, but from my experience, I would say that it's highly suspicious.
Suspicious of what?
That there was something in those telephone calls that they wanted to hide.
Sergeant Walshaw did nothing to allay those suspicions when she was interviewed by Detective Sergeant Benwell under caution.
When you asked why on such an important occasion there was no transcript of any of the 4 calls, what did she say?
She made no reply, which of course was her right because she was under caution.
But this was another question she declined to answer?
Yes.
There is one explanation for Sergeant Walshaw's silence. Nelson recorded it in the private journal he wrote. Detective Sergeant Benwell questioned Nelson about his explanation.
I put it to him that he had been told the address by his handler, and his words were something along the lines of, you're almost there, not quite, but I'm not going to say any more about it. There is certainly a suggestion that he was given that address by his handlers.
Sergeant Walshaw declined to answer any of Panorama's questions, but at the end of her police interview, she did categorically deny ever giving any information to Brian Nelson. What she can't deny is that military intelligence tried to justify the murder of Terry McDade to their agent. According to their secret files, Nelson wanted the murder gangs only to attack legitimate targets, not innocent Catholics. Which was why Nelson was upset and why his army handlers met him the day after the attack. They told him their record showed Terry McDade had been traced as having connections with the Provisional IRA. Nelson's handlers noted that on hearing this, his spirits lifted. Once 6137 had discovered that Terence was traced as Provisional IRA, he was quite content.
What do you think of the reference in the files to Terry McDade having some link with the IRA when plainly he didn't?
I suspect that was a story put together to appease Nelson.
In what way appease him?
Well, that he would feel better if he thought that there was a connection between the deceased and the Provisional IRA.
When I heard that, it was just total shock, disbelief that why add more pain to what they've already done? You know, why try to destroy Terry's memory by insulting him?
Did Terry McDade have any links or connections with the Provisional IRA?
As far as we were concerned, no, none at all.
We need the truth, and Terry deserves the justice. They have all the answers and they know what happened that night. And I also know the truth, but I want them to tell and admit why they let an innocent man die.
Terry McDade was not the only innocent victim of collusion. By our count, at least 80 people listed on Nelson's targeting files were attacked. 29 were shot dead. We do not suggest Nelson had a role in all these attacks. What is clear is that only a tiny minority of the victims were involved in terrorism.
When something's gone as badly wrong as happened in the case of Terence McDade, where an innocent man's been murdered, I would have thought they would have sat back and thought about what they were doing, or what they were doing wrong, and made some changes, but that never seemed to occur.
Because there are quite a number of disasters like Terence McDade afterwards, weren't there?
Yes, there were.
Where it had gone wrong was that the army had lost control over who was being targeted. Nelson had been handing out his targeting files to any Loyalist murder gang who asked for them. The secret army records show he copied his files at least 36 times.
I think it's a dreadful situation. He's passing it to other groups of killers who are completely outside even his control, and his handlers are just following on and letting him do it. It's a recipe for absolute disaster.
Sometimes the army seemed to encourage this disaster. The murder gang to which Nelson belonged was the UDA. Having failed to assassinate the Sinn Féin councillor Alex Maskey, Nelson urged a rival gang, the UVF, to kill Maskey and one other target. 6137 feels that if the UDA are not going to act, it is better the UVF do it than no one. Nelson gave the details of both targets to the UVF. In return, the UVF gave Nelson explosives. His handlers approved, noting that if this trade was successful, it will enhance 6137's standing, particularly if the UVF did attack the targets.
We used to have a saying in the New Scotland Yard that the basic rule of agent handling was that you ran the agent, not the agent ran you. And there is clear evidence in this case that Nelson was the leading light. He was running the show.
By copying his targeting files to murder gangs all over Northern Ireland, Nelson had bequeathed a deadly legacy. The officer ultimately responsible for this was Colonel Gordon Kerr. He had recruited Nelson. He was commanding officer of the unit that ran him. He never hid his contempt for the Stevens inquiry.
There is a further suggestion that Nelson proliferated intelligence documents within the UDA and as a result has put lives at risk on a long-term basis. This rather political allegation seems to me more designed to justify the actions of the Stevens inquiry.
Well, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, it was a fact that this explosive targeting material had been proliferated. It had been passed on to other equally murderous organisations, and nobody had any control over it.
The colonel believed that his secret world should be off limits to everyone, even to the forces of law and order.
He felt that what he was doing was right, and anybody who questioned this was wrong, and I think he resented it.
Did he have a clear grasp, do you think, of the rule of law?
No, I don't think he did.
It wasn't just the army who were colluding with murder gangs. The police were helping them too. According to the secret army records, IUC sources provided a considerable number of targeting files. 50 came from an officer in the IUC's special branch. In fact, the police inspired a murder that has become perhaps the most controversial of the Troubles. Patrick Finucane was a high-profile lawyer. Once again, the Army agent Brian Nelson helped target him, but it was the police who selected him as a target in the first place.
He was a young lawyer, and as any person in the legal business will tell you, his best years were in front of him. The work that he was doing was high profile due to the nature of the work and the controversy that surrounded many of the issues.
One of Pat Finucane's most controversial clients was this man, Patrick McGeown. He had been charged with a crime that caused revulsion around the world. An IRA funeral cortege was disrupted by a car that had lost its way. Inside were two army corporals. Believing they were under attack, the mourners blocked their escape. The soldiers were dragged into a sports ground. An army helicopter filmed them being stripped, beaten, and thrown over a wall. They were bundled into a black taxi and driven away to be shot. Their last moments were on this piece of waste ground. The prosecution claimed that Patrick McGeown had helped organize their murders, but Pat Finucane got the charges dropped early in the proceedings.
Fair outcome. Why did you feel it would? I thought we had merit in our submissions to the court. What sort of merit, Mr. Finucane? In that the case was not sufficient to put him on trial on these charges.
As client and solicitor left the courthouse, they were photographed. It was this photograph that was later to seal Pat Finucane's fate. Many of his clients ended up here at the Belfast Police Interrogation Centre. Many were active in the IRA. But some detectives made no distinction between Pat Finucane, the solicitor, and his clients. One of his clients was the IRA's commander in Belfast.
They told me that my solicitor was a provo. He's just the same as you. We'll have him taken out. And generally, just running him down, but at the same time, trying to associate him with something he wasn't associated with.
What, the IRA?
Yeah.
Labelling Pat Finucane as an IRA man to IRA prisoners was one thing, doing that to Loyalists quite another. By late 1988, some police officers were going even further. The gunman Ken Barrett, who we secretly recorded, says that younger Loyalists were being released from police interrogation, having been urged to take out Pat Finucane.
Young fellas, you know, they had come out and said this, said about Finucane, and said this and said that. And they must have said it because kids wouldn't come out and say they said about Finucane, because why would they mention Finucane? Do you understand what I mean? Finucane wouldn't have been a name in their head.
Would Finucane have been a target if this hadn't...
Hello?
Barrett's mobile interrupted what was to be a shocking allegation.
Would Finucane have been a target if this feedback hadn't reached you, do you think?
See, to be honest, Finucane would have been alive the day if the Peelers hadn't.
Say that again?
Finucane would have been alive the day
if the
Peelers hadn't interfered.
If the Peelers hadn't interfered, yeah. Do you reckon? You don't think you'd have got round to it anyway?
No. Well, solicitors were kind of way taboo, you know what I mean? Like, we used a lot of Roman Catholic solicitors ourselves, you know? They were kind of way taboo at the time, like, you didn't touch them. Do you understand me? Because they come in and seen us and all that.
They were off limits.
They were off limits.
And they acted for you like any other?
They acted for us like anybody else.
True.
You understand?
But for Barrett, Pat Finucane as a target did not stay off limits for very long. One night, says Barrett, a Loyalist godfather who organized killings introduced him to a police officer. They met in a car. The officer seems to have impressed Barrett.
Well, he was a bit of a cool fucking customer. Very, very, very sure of himself, you know. He could do more or less anything. This guy could do more or less anything.
When you met him first time, what did he actually say to you? about Finucane?
Just that Pat was one of their men, you know. He was an IRA man, like, and he was dealing with finances and stuff for him, and he was a bad boy, and if he was out, like, they'd have a lot of trouble replacing him, stuff like this, you know.
He says he'll have to go. He'll have to go. He said he's a thorn in everybody's side. He'll have to go. He was determined on pursuing that. Like, that's the one he wanted. They didn't want any fucking about. They didn't want to wait months. They wanted it done.
The police officer appears to have sized up Barrett correctly.
He says you're more, well, how do you put it? He says you're more the psychopath. He says you're more one for business here, aren't you? I says, what do you mean business? He says, no, you won. Prove he's buried. I says, oh, of course I do. He says, understand, understand. I says, yes, every time. I says, you do the business for us. If in the near future we can help you out at any stage, that'll be done. He says, yes, as long as we're on the same wavelength.
A few months earlier, military intelligence had noted in their secret records that one of 3 Belfast lawyers whom they regarded as sympathetic to the provisional IRA was Pat Finucane.
I feel that it's an insult, an egregious insult. It was easy for them to believe that he was a member of the IRA. I think their limited mentalities did not stretch to differentiating between the role of the lawyer and the offence suspected of the client. The line between the two was not apparent to them.
The killing of Pat Finucane was now being actively planned, with Barrett tasked to kill him. But he didn't know what his target looked like. Once again, the Army agent Brian Nelson was able to assist. 6 days before the murder, Barrett met Nelson on Belfast's Shankill Road.
But up on a day during the week, like, we walked down and he was actually in a car. He was in a Mazda. Because I was expecting Brian Nelson to come back with, say, an ID card, you know, saying, there you go, Finucane's photo, date of birth, whatever. I says, have you got the message? He says, oh. And he pulled it out, it was in like a wee plastic bag. He was involved in a case at that time. And he was outside court or something with a probie. You seen him fucking jubilant. I just says, that's dead on.
Barrett could now positively identify the man he was going to shoot. What he didn't know was where he lived. Once again, the Belfast minicab driver, also known as Agent 6137, was ready to oblige.
Brian knew what we were fucking doing. Brian took me up to the fucking place. You know what I mean? Brian showed me it once and that was all I had to see. Just the one snake come back up and down and past it again. You go say 1, 2, 3, 4th door down and just swing on them. No problem.
The murder was planned for a Sunday night in February 1989. Late that afternoon, the murder gang had assembled in a Loyalist club. They needed to be certain that the solicitor was at home. According to Barrett, the police officer to whom he'd been introduced had said there was one sure way of knowing this.
All I needed to know that he was in the house. If the car wasn't there, he wasn't there. He never went anywhere without the car. That was one thing that we knew. He never went anywhere without the car.
Right.
Do you understand what I mean? Don't go in if the car's not there, because you only get the one crack. If you just fuck it up, you never get the crack at it again. Do you know what I mean?
As the clock ticked towards 7, a phone call was made and weapons brought for Barrett and a second gunman. The murder gang's vehicle was a hijacked taxi. At the wheel, a young driver. They were keyed up, ready to go.
Men get nervous when they're hanging about and get a wee bit edgy. Whereas if you get the all clear and go, then it's there and that's it. You understand?
Earlier that evening, close to Pat Finucane's home, the security forces had been searching lock-up garages for weapons. The murder gang needed confirmation that the roads to and from the target were clear. According to Barrett, this came from the police officer who'd urged him to shoot Finucane. A telephone message was passed to the murder gang.
The roadblock had been taken down. And that's what this guy was telling you. The roadblock had gone.
All clear.
Okay.
That meant there's no, say, presence in the area, if you know what I mean.
Go ahead. Everything's clear, right? Unless you know where the police are at that particular time, or at that stage of the game. Well, I mean, it's a brave drive. Because you 3.5, 4 mile hour. The decision was taken, and that was it. There was none of us fucking about driving around here and driving around there. The decision was taken. Bang, let's go. That's how quickly it happens.
Executive mobile phone. Got the state of the art.
As the murder gang sped towards their target, Pat Finucane, his wife, and 3 children were gathered round the dinner table as a family.
I remember sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner.
Lovely jubbly. General Electric Company. Have we got it, John? Mr. Company Director?
There was a bang from the hallway. My father jumped up. He slammed the door shut, while my mother ran behind him and hit the personal attack button. The next thing I remember is being on the floor against the wall in the corner, holding my younger brother and sister, and shots going off very loud, and it seemed like forever. At that point, my memory blanks, but the thing I remember most is the noise. It's a place I don't care to visit very often, but I know it's there. And sometimes I go back and visit, but not often. I try not to dwell on it.
We'll be lucky if we get a week in a timeshare tent.
He had a fork in one of his hands, so whoever had killed him had arrived like a tornado and had very ruthlessly killed him.
This was an angry attack?
This was a most vicious and angry attack, and I've seen people shot in the face before, and it has always struck me as being a particularly venomous thing to shoot someone in the face. There's so much hate attached to that.
A press statement from the murder gang claimed responsibility for the execution of Pat Finucane, the IRA officer, not the solicitor. It was written by the Army agent Brian Nelson, but the prime movers had been renegade police officers.
As I told you before, Taylor's wanted him whacked, we whacked him. And that's the end of the story as far as I'm concerned.
But it is not the end of the story so far as the English police now investigating this murder are concerned. Each week, Brian Nelson met his handlers from the Army's Secret Force Research Unit, or FRU. Nelson has told the Stevens Inquiry that he kept his handlers informed of everything he knew about the murder of Pat Finucane.
I would like to state that all information concerning the Finucane affair I passed on to military intelligence through my handlers. At no point did I ever conceal or withhold any information that I was party to from them.
When you came to examine the FRU files, what struck you about the Finucane case?
The lack of any information or intelligence that was in there. It was almost like it was a non-event.
According to the commanding officer of the Force Research Unit, Colonel Kerr, there was nothing in the files because they knew nothing about Finucane being targeted. The colonel has always said that Nelson thought the intended target had been Pat Finucane's client, the IRA man Patrick McEwen, but that cannot be true. Remember the photograph that Nelson handed over to the killer of Pat Finucane? Nelson had 36 individual photographs of McEwen, whereas this was his only photograph of Finucane. I understand the Stevens inquiry has concluded that Nelson must have been told the intended target was Finucane, otherwise he would have handed over one of his many better photographs of McEwen. Colonel Kerr's unit must have known that too.
Did the army know exactly what documents and what photographs Nelson had in his intelligence dump? Did they have an inventory?
Yes, I would say they did, because the normal position was that whenever they had a meeting with their agent, they would take all the documents he had with him and photocopy them. So therefore they should have had a full record of everything that he had.
Including photographs?
Yes.
So do you find Colonel Kerr's insistence that neither the Frew nor Nelson knew that Patrick Finucane was going to be shot or was being even targeted, do you find that credible?
No.
I don't believe the claim that was made by Nelson's commanding officer that they were unaware of certain things or that they were kept in the dark by their agent. They trained him, they infiltrated him, they ran him, supported him, and monitored his activities very closely. They did it over a long period of time, a number of years, and I am not prepared to accept their story that they only knew the half of it.
You think the army have got something to hide on the Finucane murder, do you?
Yes, I think there's some unanswered questions there, yes.
Principally what?
What exactly their role was, what Nelson's role was, why this hasn't been reported as fully as so much else that Nelson did, those sort of things.
So you think the Frew are not telling the truth about Finucane?
Yes.
That's a pretty serious charge.
It's had a huge effect on all our lives. So many people, I think, have been asked to swallow so much pain and have done so, my family included. But if we are prepared to do that, then we ought not to be expected to put up with lies and deceit as well.
Eventually, the army agent Brian Nelson pushed his luck just too far. The murder of Lachlan McGinn was when everything began to unravel.
I remember hearing the loud banging noise. This was very echoing. I can remember my dad screaming, you know. I got out of bed and Daddy, you know, we just came up the top of the stairs and he fell on the landing. I could see, you know, the wounds on his body, you know, the blood, and there was blood splattered just everywhere, you know. He started to fall asleep, and the neighbour had said to me, you know, get a pillow for his head, and he was telling him not to go to sleep, and, you know, he did, and, you know, he just lay there.
Once again, Nelson had gathered intelligence on this target, which he'd received from a promising news source. Nelson had given a video camera to soldiers to film intelligence bulletins posted inside their barracks. One named Lachlan McGinn as a suspected IRA intelligence officer. As the Secret Army records noted, Nelson urged a swift attack against the targets on the video. If no attacks resulted, he said, the soldiers would not supply details of targets anymore. To justify the murder, the Loyalists said McGinn was in the IRA. The family denied this. So, in their attempt to prove they now only shot Republican terrorists, the Loyalists took the extraordinary step of pinning up some of Nelson's targeting files all over Belfast.
The documents, leaking of them. There were too many, being leaked too often, and questions were going to be asked. It was obvious that you just can't paper Belfast with security documents and get away with it. So he was very worried about his cover from that stage.
By flaunting Nelson's targeting files, the Loyalists had triggered a political explosion. The Irish government demanded an inquiry. The British government agreed. The army smelt trouble. A team of detectives from England was dispatched to Belfast, led by the then Deputy Chief Constable of Cambridge, John Stevens. The army went into a panic. One of their darkest secrets was at risk of being exposed. So their agent was given a crash course in in-depth resistance to interrogation, just in case he was arrested.
How impartial will the investigation be?
Be totally impartial, I can assure you that.
The army feared Nelson and his targeting files might be discovered, so they seized them from the flat where he'd hidden them. Nelson was also promised that if he was arrested, his handler would attempt to notify him.
I've got a fair bit to do now, so I'm asking you to excuse me and allow me to go on and continue with my investigations.
Finally, Nelson was told to deny all knowledge of the unit he worked for. The murky world of military intelligence was one thing. The British Army's public face, quite another. At their Northern Ireland headquarters, it was as if the Army couldn't do enough to help John Stevens. No sooner had he stepped off the plane than they volunteered a briefing.
I asked, just kind of out of the blue, if they themselves ran informants. And they denied this. They said categorically that they were there in support of the RUC and that the RUC had the role of intelligence gathering.
The British Army denied categorically running agents.
Categorically denied running agents.
Did you believe them?
Well, it was very early days, and I didn't want to call anybody a liar at that stage, but it was difficult to believe that they weren't.
Because it wasn't true, was it?
No, it wasn't true.
In fact, it was a complete lie.
Yes.
Was that the first of several deceptions by the army?
It was certainly the first, and there were others later, yes.
The extent of the army's deception would soon become apparent. Stevens examined documents that the police in Belfast had seized from Loyalist murder gangs. Many shared a distinctive common feature: spidery writing and details set out in a precise military style. A fingerprint finally identified the author, though not, of course, his secret role.
He felt they were getting close to him. He started to worry a great deal, very, very much, that they were getting close to him. I mean, he would shake, literally shake. I mean, if I get nervous, I'll shake. And Brian's the same, you know, you're just sort of highly strung. He was very much under stress.
Stevens now had the evidence to arrest Brian Nelson and other Loyalists. This operation was planned for dawn on the 11th of January 1990. His inquiry offices were in one of the most secure buildings in Northern Ireland. By chance, at 10 p.m. on the eve of the arrests, some detectives returned to their office.
We had a very strong regime of ensuring everything was locked up. There were guards, armed guards, on the premises 24 hours a day. And the position of the offices within the sort of centre of this large office block have themselves provided a fair amount of security, at least to a passing burglar.
We returned to Sea Park and immediately noticed the signs of a fire. There were a number of fire alarm points in the building, and I went to one, I smashed it with the heel of my shoe, and nothing happened. I ran down to another one, smashed that, and again nothing happened.
The wall alarms weren't the only alarms that didn't work. In the Stevens offices, a heat-sensitive intruder alarm system had been installed. That didn't work either.
So I went down to where there was a guardhouse where there was an officer stationed.
An RUC officer?
An RUC officer. My first words to him were to telephone for the fire brigade, and he replied that the phones were down. I then told him to get on his radio to call for help.
Will you hurry up? There's a fire!
And his reaction was one of almost disinterest of, well, you know, what do you expect me to do about it? I went to the first floor where I found a phone and was able to dial out and dial to the fire brigade.
Fire at Seaport Carrickfergus! The fire at Seaport Carrickfergus!
What had actually been destroyed?
A huge amount of our paperwork, and that would have consisted of original statements, original documents, exhibits, things that, statements we'd taken from witnesses, from individuals, people we'd interviewed, and some of those we couldn't recover because obviously they related to individuals who had maybe written a statement under caution or produced an original exhibit.
The RUC suggested that the destruction of the Stevens offices had been caused by one of their female officers carelessly discarding a cigarette in a wastepaper bin. No one in the Stevens inquiry has ever bought that.
Do you think it was arson?
Yes, I do.
Is that just a suspicion or a conviction?
It's, I strongly believe that it was deliberately set, yes.
Do you think the fire could have been caused by a carelessly discarded cigarette?
No, it wasn't caused by a discarded cigarette, absolutely not. What happened was, around about the second or third day of that inquiry, we were given some notification that something might well happen. We didn't know exactly what might happen, and that was the reason we had another duplicate office in Cambridgeshire Police Headquarters, where we had statements which made sure that when the fire took place in the headquarters that we had at Sea Park, we could continue with the inquiry. So, no, it was not caused by a cigarette.
So you're saying you had a warning that there might be a fire or something like that?
Very vague warning that something like this might happen, yes.
As he surveyed the smouldering embers of his headquarters, John Stevens resolved the arrest of Nelson and others would go ahead, on schedule, as planned.
Because of the fire, we had a pretty late night, and we're up very early to carry out a whole series of raids and hopefully arrests. The vehicles went out with all the arrest teams, and as the morning went on, various people were arrested.
But not Brian Nelson?
But not Brian Nelson.
Had he been tipped off?
Well, it looks now, with the benefit of hindsight, that must have happened.
The army had indeed kept their promise to alert him. Hours before the fire, Nelson had fled to England. Source is in such a tight corner at present, his handlers recorded, but not for long, they hoped. They thought a demoralized Stevens team would be packing their bags.
He phoned the army, apparently, and they told him to come back. They would have the documents for him to come back and carry on business as usual.
The army were going to hand him back the documents?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He told you that?
Mm-hmm. His army handlers had said, come back, that they would meet him. I think something like at 7 o'clock At 6 o'clock, the Stevens team turned up.
For Brian Nelson, the dirty undercover war was over. But for the intelligence services, the cover-up had only just begun.